Good afternoon. The most difficult sequence in the speaking lineup is always the post-lunch speaker because of what's known as technically as postprandial narcosis, that you fall asleep after the meal, but I don't think that's going to happen with our speaker here. I have one administrative announcement on behalf of the All Volunteer Force Forum. This is our third annual symposium for the All Volunteer Force. The first one was in 2016 at Kansas University, along with, in collaboration with Beth Bailey and her team there. Last year we were at the College of William and Mary. This year, of course, at Ohio State, and I'm delighted to let you know that we will be at Angelo State University in Texas, either the 21st or the 28th of March next year. And if you stay tuned or tap into the AVF Forum website, we'll keep you informed as to the specifics of that event. I have the pleasure right now to introduce our keynote speaker, and I won't read his bio. All of you can take a look at it. I will just say three things. The first one is Colonel Andrew Bacevich is a soldier who served more than 20 years in the United States Army in the combat arms, retired as a full colonel, and graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point. And the second one is that he is a scholar, Professor Emeritus at Boston University, widely published. And the third thing is, I'll put those together and say that any informed observer who puts together the short list of the premier soldier scholars in contemporary United States has to include Professor Andrew Bacevich on that list. So, Professor Bacevich, with that, it's all yours. Thank you very much.
Well, I regret the references that were made to my keynote address during the morning sessions, because it sort of created a set of expectations that I am now not going to meet. I found the discussions that we had this morning to be, informative, thoughtful, fascinating, and lo and behold, I'm about to cover the same ground all over again. So I'll try to do it fairly briskly, then maybe we'll have a little time for questions and discussions. Let me just hop right into this thing. It's a great privilege for me to be here with you. So what is the purpose of war? In simple terms, it's peace. War is evil. Large-scale, state-sanctioned violence is justified only when all other means of achieving essential objectives have been exhausted or are otherwise unavailable. You go to war only when you have to, really have to. And even then, ending the war expeditiously as possible is an imperative. Now, by common consent, the United States today has the world's best military. By some estimates, it may well be the best military in all recorded history. It's certainly the most expensive and hardest working military on the planet. Yet in the post-Cold War era, when the relative strength of U.S. forces reached its zenith, our well-endowed, well-trained, well-equipped, and highly disciplined troops have proven unable to accomplish the core tasks to which they have been assigned. We send them to war, but they don't achieve peace. So America's wars and skirmishes drag on, seemingly all without end. How to explain this paradox of a superb military that doesn't get the job done? I want to suggest that the problem lies with the present-day American military system. Now, when I use the phrase military system, what am I referring to? I think a military system is a set of principles to which a nation adheres as it goes about raising, organizing, supporting, and employing its armed forces. The existence of a military system expresses a consensus, even a contract of sorts. Through this contract, the state the armed forces, and the people set the terms for how this raising, organizing, supporting, and employing should occur. Here are, in my judgment, the specific principles, rarely acknowledged, that define the present-day American military system. First, we choose to define military service as voluntary rather than obligatory. In the United States, there is no link between citizenship and military service. It's up to you as an individual to decide if you want to take up arms in the service of your country. If you so choose, that's okay. If you choose otherwise, that's okay too. Either way, your decision is of no more moral significance than whether you wear boxers or briefs, or whether you root for the Cincinnati Reds or the Cleveland Indians. Second, while non-serving citizens are encouraged to support the troops, that hackneyed phrase, we carefully avoid specifying how this civic function is to be performed. And in practice, there are many ways of doing so, ranging from the substantive to the merely symbolic. As a practical matter, most citizens opt for the symbolic. This means that they cheer when they are invited to do so. Cheering is easy and painless. It can even make you feel good about yourself. Third, when it comes to seriously supporting the troops, we citizens expect Congress to do the heavy lifting. The Congress fulfills its obligation to the troops by routinely meeting Pentagon requests for very large sums of money. In some instances, the Congress appropriates even more money than the Pentagon has asked for, as is the case this year. That said, under the terms of our military system, oversight regarding the way this money actually gets spent tends to be spotty. Only rarely does the Congress insert itself forcefully into matters relating to what U.S. forces scattered around the world are actually doing. Yes, there are periodic hearings and witnesses with testimony offered and questions posed. But unless there is some partisan advantage to be gained, the hoopla centered on the Benghazi scandal as an example, oversight tends to be pro forma. So in practice, congressional support for the troops translates into very wide latitude for those charged with actually implementing what is routinely referred to as national security policy. Fourth principle. Under the terms of our military system, this latitude applies in spades to the commander-in-chief. The president occupies the very apex of our military system. The president may or may not know very much about war or statecraft or history or anything. Regardless, the president's authority is just about without limits. Imagine our military system empowers the president to order a nuclear attack should he see the need or feel the impulse to do so. He need not consult the Congress. He certainly doesn't need to consult you and me. Now, apart from two incidents in 1945, thankfully, presidents have not exercised this option. But they have on more occasions than you can count ordered military actions, large and small, on their own authority or after only the most perfunctory consultation. It happens all the time, including in the present moment. When Donald Trump threatened Kim Jong-un with fire and fury such as the world has never seen, he gave no hint of asking for prior congressional authorization. It's already been mentioned, and you know this. The Constitution invests in the Congress the authority to declare war. But in practice, and again, you know this, that provision has long since become a dead letter. This forms a key element in our existing military system. Fifth principle. Under the terms of that military system, there's no need to defray the costs of military actions undertaken in our name. Supporting the troops does not require citizens to pay for what the troops are doing out there wherever they are. The troops are asked to sacrifice. The rest of us view sacrifice as anathema. Indeed, in recent years, presidents who take the nation to war or who perpetuate wars that they inherit never even consider pressing Congress to increase our taxes accordingly. On the contrary, they advocate tax cuts, which of course leads directly to massive deficits. Sixth principle, pursuant to the terms of our military system, we design U.S. forces not to defend this country, but to project military power on a global basis. The Department of Defense does not exist to defend the United States. That's the job of the Department of Homeland Security. The United States Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps are all expeditionary forces designed to fight elsewhere and relying on a constellation of bases around the world to facilitate the conduct of military campaigns out there, wherever there may be. Reflect for a moment on the way that Washington divvies up the world into gigantic chunks of territory and then creates a military command to exercise jurisdiction over each. You know the names: U.S. European Command, U.S. Africa Command, U.S. Central Command, U.S. Southern Command, U.S. Northern Command, U.S. Pacific Command. One imagines that U.S. Galactic Command is next on the docket. No other nation does this, nor would the United States permit any nation to do so. Imagine the outcry in Washington if China had the temerity to create a Latin America command with a 4-star Chinese general charged with maintaining order and stability from Mexico all the way to Argentina. Finally, our military system invests great confidence in something called the military profession. Now, the legal profession exists to implement the rule of law. We hope that the result is some approximation of justice. The medical profession exists to repair our bodily ailments. We hope that health and longevity result. The military profession exists to master war. With military professionals in charge, it's our hope that our wars will conclude quickly and successfully, with peace the result. To put it another way, we look to the American military profession to avert the danger of wars that are long, costly, and inconclusive, because history suggests that long, costly, and inconclusive wars sap the collective strength of a nation and can bring about its premature decline. According to our military system, the actual direction of war falls under the purview of the most senior military professionals, those individuals who have ascended step by step to the very top of the military hierarchy. We expect 3- and 4-star generals and admirals to possess the skills to make war politically purposeful. This expectation provides the rationale for the status they enjoy and the prerogatives that they are accorded. Now, the nation that has evolved this military system that I just described is not some shithole country, to use a phrase made famous by President Trump. We are, or claim to be, a democratic republic in which all power ultimately derives from the people. We believe, indeed we are certain, that we exemplify freedom, even as we continually modify and expand the actual meaning of that term. In the aggregate, we are very rich. Since the latter part of the 19th century, we have taken it for granted that the United States of America should be the richest country on the planet, notwithstanding the fact that large numbers of ordinary Americans are anything but rich. Indeed, as kind of a corollary to our military system, we count on these non-rich Americans to volunteer for military service in disproportionate numbers, and offered sufficiently generous economic incentives, they do so. Finally, and most importantly, since 1945, we have occupied a preeminent place in the global order, a preeminence affirmed and even heightened by the successful conclusion of the Cold War at the end of the 1980s. We are not keen to share that preeminence or to see it diminished. Indeed, we have come to believe that American primacy reflects the will of God or of Providence. Dating from the early days of the Cold War, moreover, we have come to believe that the freedom, the material abundance, and the primacy that we cherish all depend upon the exercise of what we commonly call global leadership. In practice, that seemingly benign term tends to be a euphemism for unquestioned military superiority, along with special entitlements to put our military might to work. Back in the 1990s, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright said it best, and I quote, "If we have to use force, it is because we are America. We are the indispensable nation. We stand tall. We see further into the future." So other countries might design their military establishment to protect their vital interests, and the justification of their forces is defensive, but as Albright's remarks suggest, the purposes for which the United States designs its military establishment are far more ambitious. Now I want to pose this question regarding the military system that I described just moments ago. How well suited is that system today for this particular nation that sees itself as thoroughly democratic and as a champion of freedom, that wants to keep getting richer still, and that fancies itself as history's very own agent? In other words, do the principles that evolved over time to form the foundation of our military system, do those principles actually suit 21st century America? I'm going to pause here for 30 seconds because the temperature in the room has now gone above 100 degrees and I'm taking off my jacket.
Don't take any more off.
And if not, if those military principles don't suit 21st century America, then what alternative principles ought to form the basis for how we raise and organize and support and employ our forces? And what are the implications of clinging to a military system that may no longer be suitable? It will not surprise you when I say that I consider our present-day military system irredeemably flawed and deeply harmful. And my basis for that judgment is not theoretical, certainly not ideological, but pragmatic and empirical. And for proof, we need look no further than the conduct of our post-9/11 wars, especially Iraq and Afghanistan, but also lesser interventions in places like Pakistan, Somalia, Libya, Syria, Yemen, various parts of sub-Saharan Africa. The list goes on. These various undertakings have together subjected our military system to a comprehensive real-world evaluation. Collectively, they have rendered a judgment on that system. And the judgment is negative. Put to the test, that is. The American military system has failed. There is a counter-argument, of course. Look, some might say, the ultimate purpose of recent U.S. armed interventions, hither and yon, all the places we have bombed or invaded or occupied or employed proxies to fight on our behalf since 9/11, the real object of the exercise has been to avert any reoccurrence of that terrible day. Here we are, all these years later, and we've managed to avoid another 9/11. Isn't that success? Well, yes and no. For the rationale for intervention articulated by our political leaders has gone well beyond simply trying to prevent another 9/11. Our elected and appointed leaders have proclaimed that we are liberating the oppressed, spreading democracy, advancing the cause of human rights, even making an end to evil. They have depicted these as plausible and necessary goals. Yet little evidence exists to suggest that our post-9/11 wars have accomplished any of these things. Indeed, considerable evidence suggests that our post-9/11 military efforts have merely exacerbated the problems that they were intended to alleviate, while sowing anarchy across much of the greater Middle East. One thing is for sure: we have not brought about peace by even the loosest definition. And the cost so far? Well, we already talked about some of it. A couple of $1 trillion already spent, probably several more $1 trillion to come. Thousands of American lives lost. Tens of thousands of Americans grievously damaged. And even greater numbers, far greater numbers, of non-Americans killed, injured, and displaced. Now there probably are many possible explanations for why our post-9/11 military record has been so mixed, but I want to suggest that one very important explanation, perhaps the most important, relates back to those principles that form the basis of our military system. So with your indulgence, allow me to review them in reverse order. Principle number 7. The military profession. Tally up the number of 3- and 4-star generals that have commanded the Afghanistan war from headquarters Kabul since 2001. It's roughly a dozen. None of them has succeeded in bringing this war to a successful conclusion, and no such happy ending seems likely to be in the offing anytime soon. In other words, the senior officers that we expect to master war have shown no such mastery. The generals who have followed one another in presiding over the Afghanistan war are no doubt estimable and well-intentioned men, but they have not accomplished the job for which they were hired. Imagine if you contracted with a dozen different plumbers, each one seasoned, highly respected, to fix a leaking sink, and none succeeded in stopping the leak. You might begin to think that there's something amiss in the way that plumbers are trained and licensed. Similarly, one might therefore wonder if the time has come to re-examine our approach to identifying and developing very senior military officers. Or alternatively, one might consider this possibility. Perhaps our theory of war as an enterprise where superior generalship determines the outcome is flawed. Perhaps war cannot be fully mastered by generals or anyone else. It might just be, as people much smarter than me have written, that war is inherently uncontrollable. And if that's true, then perhaps we need a military system that places less confidence in the military profession while putting greater emphasis on finding ways of avoiding war altogether, or at least classifying it as an option of last resort rather than an all-purpose problem solver. Principle number 6. Organizing our forces to emphasize global power projection on a sustained basis. Reflect for a moment on the emerging security issues of our time. Certainly the rise of China is one example. Mushrooming cyber threats are a second. And climate change is a third. Just these three together pose a daunting set of challenges. It's by no means impertinent to wonder about the relevance of the current military establishment to these new challenges. Every year, we spend hundreds of billions of dollars to maintain and even enhance the lethality of a force configured for conventional power projection along with the global network of bases. For almost 2 decades now, that force has been engaged in what is a futile war of attrition with radical Islamists across much of the greater Middle East. I don't know about you, but I worry more about the implications of China's rise and about cyber threats and about climate change than I do about Islamic terrorism. I can't help but think that our military system has us focused on the wrong problem set. I've no gripe against the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps. They will no doubt continue to exist in some form, but I'm prepared to consider the possibility that they should be radically reconfigured. We need a military system that accurately prioritizes actual and emerging threats. And the existing system does not do that. Principle number 5, paying or not paying for American wars. Perhaps you will disagree, but it strikes me as more than slightly unseemly to saddle millennials and you members of Generation Z with the cost of paying for wars mostly conceived and mismanaged by my fellow baby boomers. For the life of me, I don't understand why you are not raising a ruckus over the obvious injustice. Could it be that young people simply are not paying attention? I personally subscribe to this hoary old axiom: if you want it, you should be willing to pay for it. It's an axiom that ought to guide our personal lives. It should also apply to our military system. Principles number 3 and 4, the authority of the Commander-in-Chief and the role of the Congress. Whatever rationale may once have existed for allowing the Commander-in-Chief to circumvent the Constitution's plainly specified assignment of war powers has long since lapsed. Well before Donald Trump became president, a responsible Congress ought to have reasserted its authority to declare war. That Trump is now president and is advised by the likes of the demented John Bolton invests this matter with even greater urgency. So Congress ought to assume a greater role in providing serious oversight to all aspects of U.S. national security policy. Were it to do so, the chances of fixing the defects that permeate our present military system would improve appreciably. Well, what's the likelihood of that happening? Nil, of course, until the money changers are expelled from the temple. And that won't occur until Americans who are not in league with the money changers rise up and demand it. Bear with me now. We're circling back to where we started, getting to the real key to bringing our military system into alignment with our values and our security requirements in this century. We're back to principles number 1 and 2. You will recall that number 2 refers to the present-day relationship between the American people and their military. And that relationship derives from principle number 1, our reliance on the so-called all-volunteer force. Here we come to the heart of the matter. Allow me to state my views plainly. The relationship between the American people and their military is shot through with hypocrisy. It is fraudulent. Worse still, most of us know it, even if we won't admit it out loud. In practice, the informal mandate to support the troops has produced an elaborate charade. It's theater. It's phony. If the American people have any interest in actually supporting the troops, they would pay greater attention to what the troops are being asked to do and with what results. Of course, that would require more effort on our part than cheering and waving the flag. Ultimately, it is the existence of the all-volunteer force, as we have heard already, in no way representative of the nation as a whole. It is the existence of the all-volunteer force that obviates any need to pay attention to what the troops are doing out there. the existence of the all-volunteer force allows us to ignore war. The bottom line is that we have outsourced responsibility for defending the country to people most of us don't know. By extension, we have embraced a conception of citizenship that is big on rights but minimizes obligations. The result is a military system that is unfair, undemocratic, immoral, very expensive, largely ineffective, and increasingly irrelevant to actually existing security concerns. A system that finds us perpetually engaged in the sort of long, costly, and inconclusive wars that sap the collective strength of a nation and can bring about its premature decline. The ultimate explanation for the defects of our military system is the existence of the all-volunteer force. I submit that only by reviving the tradition of the citizen soldier will it become possible to address those defects. Only when we, ordinary citizens, believe that we have an obligation to contribute to the country's defense will it become possible to devise principles for raising, organizing, supporting, and employing U.S. forces that align with our professed values and our actual security requirements. Thank you very much.
Bacevich, we have some time for questions if you're willing to take them.
Glad to do it.
Okay.
Would somebody sitting by the door run out and get 3 napkins off the lunch table and bring them here so I can wipe the sweat off my brow? Okay, students get priority, so what are your questions or comments, either way? Yes, sir, in the back.
For the citizen soldier ideal that you mentioned, what can you describe, I guess, exactly what you mean? Are you thinking Starship Troopers or something slightly different?
No, I'm thinking I think it was Professor Bailey in her talk alluded to it very briefly. And this does, I think, tend to be forgotten in the history, the military history of the country that we are conscious of. And that is, until rather recently, the citizen soldier formed the principal defense force of the country. Now, to go to a little more detail on that. The United States Army, in which I served, from the immediate aftermath of the Revolution up until well into the 20th century, was not a serious fighting force. Better to think of it as a constabulary. I mean, an entity that maintained internal order and facilitated the expansion and consolidation of our claim to North America. More directly, kill the Indians. During that long stretch of time, we're talking mostly about the 19th century, the American people were quite skeptical about what the founders had warned against, a standing army. Generally not interested in spending a whole hell of a lot of money on military things, and probably viewed themselves basically as peace-loving people, even as they're out there killing Indians. That said, from time to time, the nation found itself obliged or choosing to go to war. And we didn't have this big army to do the fighting. So we would extemporize the army. We did it in 1812, we did it in 1846, we did it in 1861. Largely, we did it again in 1898. And we extemporized it by asking people to volunteer. And they did. You know, volunteered to go take California, volunteered to preserve the Union, volunteered to whatever. Interestingly, in every instance, 1814, 1848, 1865, the immediate aftermath of the Spanish-American War, the volunteer forces raised up for the task vanished because the American volunteers were not interested in serving for long periods of time. So this citizen citizen soldier tradition really was the foundation of our military system. As Professor Bailey suggested, all this begins to change in the aftermath of World War II. Particularly the requirement as the new national security establishment discovers the need to maintain in readiness very substantial forces on a permanent basis. That creates the modern military establishment. And one could argue, the older I get, the less I'm prepared to make the argument, but one could argue that given the challenges of the Cold War, it was necessary for us to do that, to create this large, permanent, lethal military establishment ready to go to war in an instant. And during that period of time, the citizen soldier tradition met its demise with the Vietnam War, of course, just finally putting a stake through its heart. One of the things that struck me, I think, about the post-Cold War period is the absence of any really serious discussion about our real national security interests, given the fact that the challenge of communism is no longer exists. Rather, the almost automatic assumption in Washington circles after the fall of the Berlin Wall was that A, we had won. I think that's a distortion. B, we had won because of our superior military power. It's a second distortion. And C, that having won, with history now at its end, citing the famous Fukuyama argument, that the opportunities for shaping the global order, for advancing American interests, for spreading American values, were now greater than ever and could be accomplished by maintaining this large warfighting establishment and putting it to use. So it's striking to me. As soon as the Cold War ends, this period of hyper-interventionism begins. Panama, December 1989. It's like, what, 2 months after the fall of the Berlin Wall? Within a year, the Persian Gulf War of 1990-91. And then it's off to Somalia, it's off to Haiti, it's off to the Balkans, on and on and on and on. With really nary a serious discussion of what are our interests, and to what degree, given the costs that we're paying, is all this military activity actually serving our interests? And I think that the existence of the all-volunteer army is one of the reasons that we don't have that discussion. Other student questions? Yes, sir.
There's a question that continues to bother me, and it's a heavy question, and I'd like to hear your thoughts. You provide a long list of errors and defects in the current American military system. Do you think we can recover from this erroneous method of military theory? The current system appears to be less like an attitude of miscalculation or indifference, and more like an addiction. And by definition, addictions are extremely hard to break.
Well, I mean, I think it's both an attitude and an addiction. I mean, we have become, we the people, in my judgment, have become indifferent to what we're asking our soldiers to do. We disguise or camouflage the indifference by performing the rituals that we perform to indicate that we support the troops. It is an addiction, I think. Not so much an addiction for you and me. In Washington, it's an addiction. I mean, the perpetuation of war provides a rationale for perpetuating our national security establishment. And there are institutions and people who benefit from the perpetuation of that establishment. I mean, the military-industrial complex is a good example. Ike was right, it exists. But I think also the apparatus itself. You know, if you're a career officer in the Central Intelligence Agency, if you're a career Marine, if you're an admiral commanding the Pacific Fleet, it's not in your interest to ask first-order questions about why this gargantuan national security establishment exists. The perpetuation of the establishment benefits you, endows you with prerogatives, allows you to pursue your particular ambitions. So I think that indifference combined with addiction begin to get to a comprehensive explanation. Yes, ma'am.
As far as like domestically, do you think the outcome of World War I, along with other key contributors, is like an influence on the lack of interest in today's?
No, on the contrary. World War I, that is to say, our involvement in the European War of 1914-1918, our involvement was fairly brief. We declare war in April of 1917. The war ends in November 1918. Anybody venture how many Americans' lives were lost in that year and a half?
A little bit over 100,000.
Yes, 106,000 is the number. 106,000 lives. Now, those are not all killed in combat. Substantial numbers are from the great flu epidemic. But several tens of thousands. And that was a war, the President Wilson said, this was going to be the war to end all wars. It's going to be the war to make the world safe for democracy. It's going to be the war that, if we help to win it, would position us, the United States, to be able to not impose, but to invite acceptance of a new set of rules to govern the international order, Wilson's famous 14 points. Well, how did all that work out? It didn't work out at all. So by the time you get to the early 1920s, we have a considerable number of Americans who have come to the conclusion that our participation in this war, remember how unprecedented it was at that time to send American soldiers across an ocean to someplace like Europe. By the early 1920s, we have very considerable numbers of Americans who are saying, what the hell is that all about? That was stupid. We're never going to do that again. And indeed, when you then fast forward two decades to the eve of World War II, with the Nazis running amok in Western Europe, and President Roosevelt clearly taking baby steps, pointing to our intervention, it is not surprising that a very large number of Americans said, we don't want to do that again. And they constituted a movement, and what was the name of their movement? America First. America First. Now this is really very interesting because, of course, our current president revived that slogan and made it part of his candidacy in 2016. And in doing so, he caused great dismay and shock among the enlightened classes in our country because it is true that the America Firsters were wrong in arguing that we did not have important interests at stake in the European war. It is also true that some members of America First were anti-Semites. It is also true that at least some of them, probably not a hell of a lot, were crypto-Nazis. It's also true, in my judgment, that millions and millions and millions of people who adhered to the America First movement in 1940 and 1941 were people who honestly opposed involvement in another European war because they had experienced one 20 years before, and all the promises attached to that, none of the promises came true. And I think the reason it's important to know that history a little bit, because that helps you understand President Trump. I would bet my paycheck, had zero understanding of what the original America First movement was about. That said, this intuitively brilliant politician, maybe a despicable human being and a bad president, but he's an intuitively brilliant politician, seemed to grasp that the particular moment of 2016, at that particular moment, as had been the case back in 1940 and 1941, there are a considerable number of Americans who had come to the conclusion that they didn't want more war. And they voted for him, and now we're stuck with him. Did that answer the question? Okay.
I just, not to push back too much, but I just kind of wonder, it seems like you're kind of saying that the areas that have the most volunteers are the ones suffering, that they're bearing the cost because they're the only ones paying attention to what's going on. And I just wonder, because from where I'm from, there's a disproportionate amount of people that I went to high school with that enlisted. And I think that they are more willing to go than I think that people give them credit for. And not that they understand everything that's going on, but I think that it almost seems backwards the amount of people that are more in favor of intervention are the same ones that are volunteering at a higher rate.
Is it a Marxist term? False consciousness? Is that Marxist? Is that a Marxist term? Somebody? False conscious? In other words, and this would be my interpretation, it was probably erroneous, but you basically have been socialized and propagandized to believe things that are contrary to your own interests, right? It actually describes my 4 years at West Point, but that's a different topic. If we said, why do people at this juncture choose to join the military? And my answer is for a host of reasons. I've never been a young woman, so I can't comment on that, but I was once a young man, and there is something, at least affects some young men who feel that somehow or other they're called upon to demonstrate their masculinity, their manliness, and they may see military service as a way to do that. There are people who love this country dearly, believe it is worth defending, and enlist because they wish to participate in it, and may not have thought a lot about how long the war in Afghanistan has been going on, or the circumstances that led us to invade Iraq in 2003. They're not sort of involved in the politics. But to some of the discussion from this morning, let us not pretend that economic considerations don't enter into this. I mean, what was the number we give on enlistment bonuses?
$424 million.
So imagine if that line in the budget got zeroed out. How do you think the recruiting effort for fiscal year, whatever we're in, 2019 or something, would go? I can tell you how it would go. None of the services would meet their mission. So I think it's a complex set of motivations, but the money piece is part of the equation. Yes, sir.
You talked about the military as a profession, and now we've been in war for almost 2 decades.
Right.
That seems like a tremendous growth in the possibility for more military professionals. My question is, why don't we spend the resources in recruiting military professionals and focus that energy on creating professionals to help avoid war?
2 reasons, I think. One is that those people are called diplomats, I guess, right? It appears to me that the Foreign Service, the State Department, don't exercise a lot of leverage on Capitol Hill. You know, when it comes time to start allocating money, there's no strong constituency that demands that the State Department should get more money than it did. Matter of fact, you know, when Secretary Gates was Defense Secretary, I think Mattis has also said the same thing. Hey, we need a strong diplomatic corps. But the Congress does not take well to that. So that's part of the problem. I think another problem is that it's a conceptual problem. Are you personally in favor of avoiding war?
Personally, yeah.
Okay, I am too. I'm not sure that I have any kind of a detailed programmatic plan to do that. I mean, I have a sort of general sense. So let's take the case of Iran, where demented John Bolton could well get us in a war. Let's take the case of Iran and its its rivalry with Saudi Arabia. Why the hell would anybody want to be an ally of Saudi Arabia? I have no idea. I mean, Saudi Arabia is this kind of invented country. It was founded in 1931, I think. Iran is an expression of an ancient civilization. It's been around for centuries. There is something to Iran that Saudi Arabia can barely pretend to. Point number one. Point number two, everything we know about Iran suggests that there is a massive cohort of young people whose orientation is toward the West. They want to become part of modernity. That doesn't mean they want to, be annexed by the United States of America, but their basic orientation is toward what we would hope it to be. It seems to me that a wise strategy with regard to Iran that would look to the avoidance of war would be to bet on those younger people. Now, they will decide the fate of their country. We're not going to decide the fate of their country. Matter of fact, if we presume to try to decide the fate of their country, we'll alienate them. We'll turn them against us. So the operative question becomes, what on the margins can we do to encourage them, to strengthen them? And I think there's answers. The answers are cultural, educational exchanges. Don't stick our nose into their politics. With the hope that, over a period of time, 50 years, something like that, that they will emerge as the people who govern that country. Because the mullahs are going to get old, and as far as I can tell, the younger people don't want to live under the thumb of the mullahs. So you probably see the logic of what I just described, but I'm not sure that I could sell it to anybody as a basis for policy. It's pretty darn speculative. Follow me? Okay. How much time do I have? One more. Okay. Did any female students? One female student. We have a significant gender imbalance in the Q&A. And if there's any other female students who would like to have the last question, it appears not. So you got it, sir.
I want to briefly reference your time at West Point. So some, like Tom Riggs, have argued that they're really have pernicious effects for civil military relations. So I was curious to hear your thoughts on professional military education and how you would reform it to make it better for civil military relations and perhaps to address some of the problems that you saw earlier.
Well, I'm on record. I'm on record for many things that nobody pays attention to. I'm on record for suggesting that we need to have a radically different way to identify and select young people to become officers in our services. Basically, what we got right now is you got a pathway through pathway through the service academies. You got a pathway through ROTC, and at least I'm not sure how much, but there is a pathway through officer candidate school, basically one company. So that's how my son got his commission. And many of the ROTC kids who are getting four-year scholarships, in a sense, are being identified back when they're in high school, same with the service academy. My point would be, we have no idea. When you're looking at somebody who's 17 years old, we have no basis for evaluating their potential as military officers. And it would make a lot more sense to me if we use the first 2 years of undergraduate education, or maybe the first year. So there's an ROTC detachment here at Ohio State. Of course, you guys, what's like 65,000 students here or something?
65,000.
Jeez. Okay, so we have a battalion-sized ROTC detachment that basically tries to get to know all the freshmen and to be able to identify why Joe here and Jill seem to have what it takes to be a military officer, and Sarah and Sam not so much. So at the end of freshman year, we go to Joe and Jill and we say, you just won the lottery. We're going to give you full scholarships the rest of your time here. You're going to have to pay us back with 5 years of military service on the other end. And then when Joe and Jill leave here, we pin their bars on, and then they go off to West Point or Annapolis or Colorado Springs to spend a brief period of time, 1 year maybe, becoming socialized into the service. Here's where they learn how to be what it means to be an officer. And they all do it together. So everybody from year group 2018 who goes in the Army is a West Pointer. Everybody from year group 2018 that goes into the Navy and the Marine Corps, they're Annapolis people. So I think what that would do would be to potentially reduce the gap between the officer corps and society, because the officer corps would come from here, would come from Ohio State, right? And I think it would also end these uncomfortable sort of distinctions within the current officer corps about where you go to school. Everybody would go to the same finishing school of the service academy. Why? You like that idea? Why won't it happen? No Army-Navy game. So the hell with the country, we got to have the Army-Navy game. Thanks very much. I enjoyed this.